The concept of a Galactico was popularized in the early 2000s when Real Madrid brought a flurry of superstars to the Santiago Bernabeu. And while the period from 2000 to 2006 is officially recognized as the Galactico era, I would argue there have been three distinct eras, each with very contrasting transfer philosophies as well as results on and off the pitch. But the centerpiece of every one of these eras was one man who led Madrid out of dark times on more than one occasion. It all kicked off in the year 2000, when Florentino Perez wrestled presidency of Real Madrid. It seems strange to remember a pre-Perez era, but Lorenzo Sanz before him had not been doing a poor job by any means, with Madrid winning the Champions League twice under his stewardship and having a pretty standard transfer policy, mixing local talents with some key international additions. Madrid were successful, but it was all very normal, and fans wanted something more than that. What Perez represented was daring, something new and exciting. His campaign for presidency was built on two foundational principles: clearing the club's massive debts, which he achieved by selling the club's training ground under dubious circumstances. More importantly, he promised that all the biggest stars in the world would make the Santiago Bernabeu their home, and he promised to slowly take over Europe by signing one global superstar per season, a Galactico. But it wasn't just that. He promised that he would hit hard and fast, not just by signing perhaps the best player in the world. He would be prying Figo from the hands of their biggest rivals, Barcelona. Fans' mouths were watering. The offer was too good to refuse, and Perez took up the presidency, and he delivered. Luis Figo would cross the Spanish divide, a cardinal sin, and he would pay the price as Barcelona fans took out their frustrations at his betrayal on him at every opportunity, in one of the most violent transfers of all time. But Perez had gotten his man by breaking the world record. And it wasn't just a statement about the commencement of the Galacticos era, it was a declaration of war. The following year, Perez one-upped himself, breaking his own world record, bringing in 29-year-old Zinedine Zidane from Juventus. The year after that, it was El Femeno, who joined as the second most expensive signing of that window. Beckham followed, the most expensive signing of his window, and then Michael Owen, who was the exception price-wise due to his injury record and contract situation, but as a Ballon d'Or winner, he still met the criteria of being a Galactico. Debatably, the final two Galacticos of this era came in 2005, with Robinho and Sergio Ramos arriving for fees in excess of 20 million euros, high transfer fees in the mid-2000s. The original Galacticos era was built on bringing in 1 or 2 star signings per season, and having those signings be in their absolute prime, with the average age of the Galacticos being 25. With a side with this much quality, success was bound to follow. Los Blancos lifted 2 La Ligas and had a Champions League win that produced one of the most iconic moments of all time. But despite all of this, the originals era was nowhere near a fairy tale. Despite the silverware, fans felt the utter domination they showed in the transfer market was not being matched on the pitch, and many believed the root cause of this was the Galacticos policy for many different reasons. Even a club as rich as Madrid need to balance the books, and Perez believed he had found the ultimate solution. A team of 11 Zidanes was too rich for any side, but what he believed he could build was a team of Zidanes and Pavons. Pavon was a promising academy player, and Perez's approach was to splurge on the stars and fill the rest of the gaps with functional transfers or academy players to foster a relationship with the fans. It made sense on paper, but it also created a natural divide in the squad between the Galacticos and the rest. A difference which, by the way, was reflected in their salaries, creating further separation within the dressing room. This dynamic did not just affect the Pavons, by the way. Non-Galactico signings also felt the strain, as Perez offered them much lower wages, as he had to divert every remaining euro he had to the Galacticos. Perez, of course, did not sign any of the Galacticos to have them sitting on the bench. Apart from their incredible footballing ability, every Galactico was a walking marketing unit, and in fact, their marketability was often the biggest factor Perez considered when deciding who to sign, and Beckham in particular was viewed as a walking billboard. What you may also have noticed is that almost none of the Galacticos were defensive players. The simple reason? It is much harder to market the best defensive player in the world than the best attacker. A similar framework of thinking that often works its way into the Ballon d'Or voting. So the on-the-pitch result of the marketing-based transfers was that the team was highly unbalanced, with too much attention on eye-catching attacking players. And matters got worse, as feeling underappreciated, defensive players like Claude Makelele left the club. It was a problem that each manager during the Originals era would find awaiting them, with Del Bosque's laissez-faire approach meaning the brilliant attacking brains in the side could flourish, but it also meant that the defense was sacrificed. This was a similar problem that Luxemburgo faced in his brief stint, and he changed the formation looking to fit in more flair players into the side, so that neither Perez nor the Galacticos would complain about who was on the pitch. Queiroz took the opposite approach, looking to bring in more structure and defensive discipline to the side, but what that led to was more Galacticos on the bench than was ideal, as well as a less aesthetically pleasing style of play. And when looking at the performance of the first batch of Galacticos, it was very much hit and miss. The marvel and the mess of the first Galacticos era came to a disappointing end, as the lack of dominance on the pitch, compared to their spend, paired with the increasing debt the club was taking on to make the Galacticos possible, meant that the fans became increasingly pessimistic about having Perez at the helm. 2006 brought an end to the Originals era, as Perez was ushered out of the club. His absence would prove to be nothing more than a hiatus. Los Blancos threatened to fall into chaos following his departure. During his 3-year absence, Real Madrid's blip in the Champions League threatened to turn into a hoodoo as they exited the round of 16 in each season. The emergence of Guardiola's Barcelona did not help, as Real Madrid were threatening to enter a barren era domestically as well, after initially having had decent domestic success in the years following Perez's resignment. The result was a chaotic period, marred by votes of no confidence, interim presidents, and allegations of vote rigging, meaning that Real Madrid burned through 4 presidents in 3 years, until eventually they craved the clear direction of Perez. He ran uncontested, and it was clear that his time away had allowed him to refine his approach to squad building. The central ideology was still the same, as Galacticos was still the goal, and Perez's first window back made this abundantly clear. He signed a Ballon d'Or winner in Kaká, almost breaking the transfer record in the process. He one-upped himself, signing another Ballon d'Or winner, and this time making sure to break the transfer record in the process. That same summer, they brought home one of Spain's finest, and also went big on a future Ballon d'Or winner. A few seasons later, during the All-Star period, Perez broke the record again, this time with a Welshman entering the fray, and soon after, the World Cup's golden boy joined, as James Rodriguez donned the famous white strip. James may have been the last bona fide Galactico of the All-Star era, but it represented a clear change in Perez's thinking. The age profile of signings had decreased, as players no longer had to be in their absolute prime. But more importantly, in addition to brand building, Perez was also now thinking about squad building. The squad building extended to the dugout, as a higher caliber of manager was also now key to the strategy, both in terms of tactical acumen, as well as being able to deal with the egos of Galacticos. Pellegrini would be the first through the doors, and he headed one of the most underrated seasons in La Liga history. Mourinho followed him, and the beautiful chaos of his tenure would define an era, while Carlo Ancelotti, a wise old head, was able to bring calm to the club after the Mourinho storm. All 3 managers would broadly deal with a similar starting 11, which was defined by its remarkable balance, as the Galacticos knew they would be on the pitch week in, week out. But this was paired with non-Galactico players who did more than their fair share. And crucially, while these players may not have had the Galactico moniker upon signing, many of them were not far off Galactico level ability-wise, or they did more than their fair share defensively. What this distribution of players, both ability-wise and positionally, meant is that the All-Star Galacticos were much more fluid. They weren't flawless defensively, but they were able to hunker down when needed, as we occasionally saw during the Mourinho era. But that same 11 were capable of being hyper-offensive, blitzing teams and putting away goals for fun under Mourinho and Pellegrini. But the balance and age profile of the squad meant that even post-Mourinho, a more hands-off manager like Ancelotti could put in place broad principles and trust the intelligence of his players to do the rest on the pitch. This refined approach to transfers didn't just mean that the All-Stars won more silverware than the Originals. Their younger age profile upon signing meant that they were longer-term investments, whose era as a unit lasted longer. The careful squad building also meant players weren't signed for signing's sake. Each was brought in to fill a specific position, so with less star players on the bench, there was also a lot less disgruntlement about any player being on the bench. The higher level of scouting also meant that the bona fide Galacticos did better on average than the Originals. It looked like Perez had perfected his strategy, but a businessman as savvy as him knew that not refreshing his strategy meant stagnation and eventually death. So he looked at the transfer market and made note of a few new things. They had an expensive stadium build on the horizon. Transfer fees for the very best players in the world were skyrocketing, especially in a post-Neymar to PSG world. There were now more clubs around Europe and the world capable of matching Real Madrid euro for euro. And to top it all off, FFP was becoming a bigger and bigger issue. As the Galacticos Mark II were beginning to age, Perez decided that he shouldn't wait for the entire side to age out before replacing them with one Galactico per season like he used to. New market conditions demanded a new strategy. Perez had spent big in the last couple of seasons of Era 2, and then there was a strange lull at the Santiago Bernabeu, as for 3 seasons in a row, Madrid spent less than 70 million euros. And then came the 18-19 window. The season defined how Florentino Perez was plotting to build the Galacticos Mark III. 4 signings came in, and while 35 million for a goalkeeper drew attention at this time, what really caught the eye was the signing of a young Brazilian. Los Blancos had agreed to stump up 45 million euros for a 16-year-old, making him the 3rd most expensive teen in history. Vinicius wouldn't even be allowed to join the club by FIFA until he turned 18. And even then, he first spent considerable time in Castilla before joining the first team. Regularly signing Galacticos in their prime, or even just entering their prime, had become financially untenable, so Vinicius was a statement signing. Get the Galactico before they become a Galactico. A season later, Perez repeated the trick, signing 17-year-old Rodrigo for 45 million again, with the Brazilian again having to wait a year before he was eligible to join. One by one, Perez was bringing in baby Galacticos, who'd be given the time to bed in and be an understudy before replacing an outgoing all-star Galactico, just like clockwork. Crucially, signing players so young meant they had not had time to build a global brand. It was the first era of Galacticos where footballing ability was the primary deciding factor, with marketability being a bonus. Because Perez now realized that the all-white strip had the ability to create the Galacticos. But there was still one traditional Galactico that Perez could not resist, as his old habits got the better of him when he signed a 29-year-old Eden Hazard in the final year of his contract for 100 million euros. But Hazard was a blip in this era, as Perez's strategy was now clear. Sign baby Galacticos young, even if for a high price, because 5 years from now, they would cost us double. Camavinga, Tchouaméni, Jude Bellingham, and Kylian Mbappe would walk through the doors season after season, completing a smooth transition from the All-Star era. And for the most part, the careful scouting has meant that the signings have not just been successful, but Madrid's investments have already appreciated. Florentino Perez is what happens when football knowledge meets ruthless business acumen, and his approach to Los Blancos has seen them remain as one of the very biggest clubs in the world. And one of the most memorable eras of Perez's reign was when he appointed a certain Jose Mourinho. Click on screen to see how Mourinho's Madrid era affected his legacy.